The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Elias Crawford's antique shop in downtown Millbrook, Alabama, casting long shadows across the cluttered aisles of forgotten treasures. Donna Lourdes Washington moved carefully between the displays, her weathered hands polishing each piece with the same dedication she'd shown for the past 3 years. At 72, Lourdes had the kind of dignity that poverty couldn't diminish. Her grey hair was always neatly braided, her modest dresses clean and pressed despite their age. She hummed old gospel hymns while she worked, her voice soft but sure, filling the quiet spaces between the tick of antique clocks. "Lourdes," Elias called from behind the counter, his voice carrying that particular tone she'd learned to recognize, smooth as honey, but with something sharp underneath. "Come here a minute." Elias Crawford was 55, successful by Millbrook standards, with 3 businesses in town and property scattered throughout the county. He was the kind of man who measured his worth in what he owned, and what he owned included the small rental house where Lourdes lived on Magnolia Street. "Yes, Mr. Crawford?" Lourdes approached the counter, setting down her polishing cloth. "You know I've always appreciated your work here," Elias began, his pale blue eyes studying her face. 3 years you've been helping me out, keeping this place spotless, organizing the inventory. You've been valuable to me." Lourdes nodded politely, waiting. She'd learned that when Elias Crawford took his time getting to a point, the point was usually something she wouldn't like. "The thing is, Lourdes, I've been thinking about our arrangement. You work here part-time, I pay you a fair wage, you rent that little house from me at a good price. It's all very professional." He leaned against the counter, his expensive watch catching the light. "But it could be so much more. Sir, I'm proposing we make this more personal. You could move into my house, that big place on Elm Street. No more rent, no more worrying about money. I'd take care of you, Lourdes, really take care of you." His smile was practiced, the kind he'd used to close deals for 30 years. The meaning behind his words settled on Lourdes like a heavy blanket. She'd seen this coming for months. The way his compliments had become more personal, the way he'd started touching her shoulder when he spoke to her, the way he'd begun asking about her church activities with barely concealed irritation. "Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, "I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept. It wouldn't be right." "Right?" Elias's smile faded slightly. "What's not right about a man taking care of a woman? About companionship?" "I'm a Christian woman, Mr. Crawford. I've been walking with the Lord for over 50 years. What you're suggesting, it goes against everything I believe." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock. In the corner, Elias's expression hardened, the practiced charm slipping away to reveal something colder underneath. "That's your final answer?" he asked. "Yes, sir, it is." Elias straightened up, his voice losing all warmth. "Well then, I guess we need to discuss some changes. Your work here, I'm going to have to let you go. Business has been slow, and I can't afford extra help anymore." Lourdes felt her heart sink, but kept her voice steady. "I understand. And the house on Magnolia Street. I'm going to need that back too. I've got family coming to town, need the space. You'll have until the end of the week to find somewhere else." The cruelty of it hit her like a physical blow. Lourdes had no family in Millbrook, no savings to speak of. Her social security barely covered her basic needs, and at 72, finding new work and housing would be nearly impossible. "Mr. Crawford, please. I've always paid my rent on time, never caused any trouble. Business is business, Lourdes. I thought you understood that." He turned away, shuffling through papers on his desk. "You can finish out the week here, collect your final pay on Friday." That evening, Lourdes sat in her small living room on Magnolia Street, surrounded by the simple possessions that made up her life. Her Bible lay open on her lap to the book of Job, and she read the familiar words about suffering and faith. Outside, The evening choir of crickets and tree frogs created a symphony that had comforted her through many difficult nights. She thought about her late husband Samuel, who died 15 years ago, leaving her with memories of a good marriage, and not much else. She thought about her daughter Maya, who lived in California with her own family and struggles. Maya had offered to have her mother come live with them, but Lourdes had always insisted on maintaining her independence. "Lord," she whispered into the gathering darkness, "I don't know what you have planned for me, but I trust in your goodness. Help me to be strong." Friday arrived with unseasonable coldness for Alabama in October. The morning mist clung to the streets of Millbrook like a damp blanket, and Lourdes pulled her thin cardigan tighter as she walked to Crawford's Antiques for her final day of work. The shop felt different now, hostile in a way it never had before. Elias barely acknowledged her presence, speaking only to give her specific instructions about inventory she needed to finish organizing. By noon, it was clear he wanted her gone as quickly as possible. "Here's your final pay," he said curtly, handing her an envelope without meeting her eyes, "and I'll need the keys to the house by tonight." Lourdes opened the envelope and counted the bills. Exactly what he owed her, no more, no less. She'd hoped he might show some small mercy, perhaps pay her a little extra to help with her transition, but Elias Crawford was a man who calculated everything down to the penny. "Mr. Crawford," she tried one more time, "isn't there any way we could work something out? I could take a pay cut, work more hours." "The decision's been made, Lourdes." His voice was flat, final. "I suggest you use your time to find other arrangements." That afternoon, Lourdes walked through downtown Millbrook, visiting every business she could think of. The responses were all variations of the same theme. "Sorry, no openings. Wish we could help. Try back in a few months." At her age, with limited skills and no references other than Elias Crawford, finding work seemed impossible. She stopped by the First Baptist Church, where she'd been a member for 20 years. Pastor Williams, a kind man in his 40s, listened to her situation with growing concern. "Sister Lourdes, this is terrible. Of course we'll help however we can." He pulled out a small notebook and began writing. "Let me make some calls, see if any of our members have work or know of a place you could stay. I don't want charity, Pastor, just a chance to earn my way. I understand, but sometimes accepting help is how we let God work through other people." By evening, Pastor Williams had found temporary solutions, a few odd jobs cleaning houses, the possibility of staying with the elderly Mrs. Henderson for a week or two. It wasn't enough for long-term stability, but it was something. Lourdes spent her last night in the Magnolia Street house packing her few belongings into 2 worn suitcases and a canvas bag. She touched each familiar surface, the kitchen table where she'd eaten countless meals, the window where she'd watched seasons change, the corner where she knelt to pray each morning. At precisely 8 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Elias Crawford stood on her porch, his expensive suit incongruous in the modest neighborhood. "Time's up," he said simply, extending his hand for the keys. Lourdes handed them over, picking up her suitcases. "Mr. Crawford, I want you to know that I don't hold any anger toward you. I'll be praying for you." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or annoyance. "Save your prayers for yourself, Lourdes. You're going to need them." As she walked away into the cold night, Lourdes heard the door of her former home close behind her with a sound like finality. She made her way to Mrs. Henderson's house, where a porch light burned like a beacon of hope in the darkness. But even as she knocked on that door, Lourdes couldn't shake the feeling that her real trials were only just beginning. 3 weeks later, Lourdes's temporary arrangements had crumbled like autumn leaves. Mrs. Henderson had fallen ill and needed her daughter to move in as caretaker. The house-cleaning jobs had dried up when word got around town about her situation. People were kind but cautious, unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a dispute with Elias Crawford, who held too much economic power in Millbrook to cross. Now, as November's chills settled over Alabama, Lourdes found herself among the invisible population of Millbrook, the homeless. She'd spent the last 5 nights sleeping behind the abandoned Piggly Wiggly, wrapped in a thin blanket Pastor Williams had given her, surviving on day-old bread from the church food pantry and water from public fountains. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the humiliation. Lourdes had worked her entire life, raised a daughter, maintained her dignity through poverty and widowhood. Now she was just another face that people looked through, another problem they hoped someone else would solve. "Ma'am, you can't sleep." "Here," the young police officer said, his flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Officer Martinez had found her twice before, and his voice carried more weariness than authority. "I'm sorry, but we've had complaints." Lourdes gathered her blanket and few possessions, her joints aching from the cold ground. "I understand, officer. I'll move along." "Ma'am, there's a shelter in Birmingham, about 40 miles north. They might have space." "I don't have money for bus fare," Lourdes said quietly, "and this is my home. I've lived in Millbrook for 20 years. Officer Martinez looked uncomfortable. He was young enough to be her grandson, probably with a grandmother of his own somewhere. "I wish there was more I could do." "You're just doing your job, son. I don't blame you." As Lourdes walked through the empty streets, her breath visible in the cold air, she thought about the phone call she'd received from her daughter Maya 2 days ago. Maya had been frantic when she finally reached her mother at the church. "Mama, just come to California, please. We'll make room somehow. The kids can share a room. Baby, you're already stretched thin with your own family, and David's just gotten back to work after his injury." Lourdes had kept her voice steady, not wanting her daughter to hear the desperation. "I'll be fine. God will provide." But standing on the empty street at 3 a.m., shivering in the Alabama cold, Lourdes wondered if she'd made the right choice. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, but uprooting her daughter's family felt like admitting defeat. She made her way to the abandoned railway station on the outskirts of town. The old building had been boarded up for years, but there was a covered platform where freight trains used to stop. It would provide some shelter from the wind, and the police rarely patrolled this far out. As she settled onto the concrete platform, wrapping her blanket around her thin frame, Lourdes opened her Bible to Psalm 23. The pages were damp from the humidity, and she had to squint to read by the distant streetlight. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she whispered into the darkness. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, lying down on cold concrete instead of green pastures, wanting for food and shelter and warmth. But faith, she'd learned over 7 decades, wasn't about getting what you wanted. It was about trusting that God's plan was bigger than your understanding. A train whistle sounded in the distance. Though no trains had run these tracks in years, the sound was haunting, lonely, like the cry of something lost. Lourdes pulled her blanket tighter and closed her eyes, praying for strength to face another day. She didn't see the expensive sedan that pulled into the parking lot of the abandoned station, or the figure that sat behind the wheel, watching her through the darkness. The cold November rain had been falling for 3 days, turning Lourdes's makeshift shelter at the railway station into a miserable refuge. Water dripped through gaps in the platform roof, and her blanket was damp, no matter how carefully she tried to keep it dry. Her cough had gotten worse, a deep, rattling sound that scared her more than she wanted to admit. She'd lost weight over the past month, her clothes hanging loose on her shrinking frame. The church food pantry helped when she could get there, but Pastor Williams had been pressuring her to accept more help. Help she knew the small congregation couldn't really afford. "Sister Lourdes," he'd said just yesterday, "this has gone on long enough. We're going to find you a place, even if we have to take up a special collection. Pastor, these people work hard for their money. They shouldn't have to support me because I was too proud to compromise. Too proud? Sister, you stood up for your faith. That's not pride, that's righteousness. But lying on the cold concrete at 2 a.m., listening to the rain drip steadily into a growing puddle beside her, righteousness felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The headlights appeared suddenly, cutting through the darkness and rain. Lourdes squinted as a familiar sedan pulled into the abandoned parking lot. Her heart sank as she recognized the car and the man who stepped out of it. Elias Crawford stood under a large umbrella, wearing an expensive overcoat that probably cost more than Lourdes had earned in her final month of work. He approached the platform slowly, his polished shoes clicking on the wet asphalt. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying that same smooth tone she remembered. "Look what we have here. The righteous Lourdes Washington, living like a queen in her palace." Lourdes struggled to sit up, pulling her damp blanket around her shoulders. "Mr. Crawford, what brings you out here in the middle of the night? I heard about your situation. Small town, news travels fast." He stepped closer to the platform, staying just out of the rain. "I have to say, I'm surprised. I thought surely someone would have taken you in by now. But I guess even Christian charity has its limits. People have been kind enough to let you sleep on the streets, apparently." His laugh was soft and cruel. "Tell me, Lourdes, how's that faith working out for you? Has your God provided for you the way you expected?" Lourdes met his gaze steadily, though her body was shaking from cold and exhaustion. "My circumstances don't change what I believe, don't they?" Elias set his umbrella aside and sat on the edge of the platform, careful to keep his expensive clothes away from the puddles. "Look at yourself, Lourdes. Really look. You're sick, you're cold, you're hungry. You're 72 years old, and you're living like a homeless vagrant, all because of your precious principles. What do you want, Mr. Crawford? I want to make you an offer, the same offer I made 2 months ago, but with better terms." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "Your old job back, with a raise. Your house on Magnolia Street, rent-free, and this—" He opened the envelope, revealing a thick stack of $100 bills. $5,000, just to get you back on your feet." Despite herself, Lourdes's eyes fixed on the money. $5,000 was more than she'd seen in one place in her entire life. It would mean food, warmth, security. It would mean she could call Maya and tell her everything was fine, that she didn't need to worry anymore. "There's just one condition," Elias continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You stop all this religious nonsense. No more church, no more Bible reading, no more praying. You admit that your faith was just superstition, and you start living in the real world." The rain continued to fall, drumming on the platform roof like fingers on a table. Lourdes looked at the money, then at Elias's face, then out into the dark. Empty night. Think about it, Lourdes. What's more important, your pride or your life? Because that's what this is about now. You're not going to survive another month out here, and we both know it. Lourdes's hands trembled as she reached toward the envelope. The money seemed to glow in the dim light, promising warmth and comfort and dignity. All she had to do was say the words. All she had to do was deny everything she'd believed for 70 years. She began, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Yes?" Elias leaned forward, sensing victory. "I need to think about it." Elias smiled, but it wasn't pleasant. "Of course you do. You have until tomorrow night, Lourdes. Same time, same place. But don't take too long to decide. Winter's coming, and I don't think you'll make it to spring out here." He stood up, brushing off his coat, and picked up his umbrella. "Oh, and Lourdes, don't bother going to your church friends for help. I've made some generous donations to First Baptist recently. Pastor Williams knows where his bread is buttered." As the sedan's taillights disappeared into the rainy night, Lourdes sat alone on the platform, staring at the wet ground where Elias had been sitting. The smell of his expensive cologne lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of rain and decay. For the first time since her ordeal began, Lords Washington wept. By the next evening, Lords could barely stand. The cold rain had turned to sleet, and her cough had worsened to the point where each breath was a struggle. She'd spent the day huddled on the platform, alternating between fever and chills, her Bible pressed against her chest like a shield, but as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, even the Bible couldn't warm her. Her hands were so numb she could barely turn the pages, and the words swam before her eyes. She tried to pray, but the words seemed to freeze in the air before reaching heaven. When the familiar headlights appeared in the parking lot, Lords felt a mixture of relief and shame that frightened her more than the cold. Elias Crawford approached the platform, wearing a heavy coat and boots, looking like a man prepared for winter weather. He carried a thermos and a paper bag that smelled like hot food. "You look terrible," he observed, setting the thermos and bag beside her. "Chicken soup and coffee. Figured you could use it." Lords's hands shook as she opened the thermos, the steam rising from the hot coffee like a small miracle. The warmth hit her stomach and spread through her body, and for a moment she felt almost human again. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." Elias sat down beside her, closer than before. "Have you made your decision?" Lords took another sip of coffee, feeling the caffeine clear her head slightly. She looked out at the dark parking lot, then back at the man who held her future in his hands. "I've been thinking about what you said, about faith and reality. And maybe I've been holding on to something that was never really there." The words felt like poison in her mouth, but her body craved the warmth and food he'd brought. Maybe faith is just something poor people tell themselves to feel better about. Being poor. Elias smiled, and this time it was genuinely pleased. "Now you're being practical. What else?" Lords closed her eyes, fighting against everything her heart wanted to say. "Maybe there is no God. Maybe there's just people, and the choices they make and the consequences." "Very good. And what choice are you making, Lords?" The final words came out in a rush before she could stop herself. "I accept your offer. The job, the house, the money, all of it. And I'll stop going to church. I'll stop reading the Bible. I'll stop believing." Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope of money, along with a set of keys. "These are for the house on Magnolia Street. I had it cleaned and restocked with food. Your job starts Monday morning, same hours, better pay." Lords took the money and keys with hands that no longer seemed to belong to her. The bills felt real, solid, more substantial than any prayer she'd ever whispered. "There's just one more thing," Elias said, his voice taking on that familiar smoothness. "I want you to prove you're serious about this new arrangement. I want you to throw that Bible in the trash." Lords looked down at the worn book in her lap. It had been her mother's before her, the pages filled with underlined verses and margin notes written in faded ink. It had seen her through her wedding, the birth of her daughter, her husband's death, and countless dark nights when it was the only light she had. "Go ahead," Elias urged. "It's just paper and ink, just superstition. If you're really committed to this new life, it should be easy." With movements that felt mechanical, disconnected from her will, Lords picked up the Bible and walked to the trash barrel beside the platform. She held the book over the opening, her hands trembling. "I can't," she whispered. "Yes, you can, because you know it's the right thing to do. You know it's practical. You know it's survival." Lords thought about the warm house waiting for her, the steady job, the dignity of being able to pay her own way again. She thought about calling Maya and telling her not to worry anymore. She thought about sleeping in a real bed tonight, eating a hot meal, taking a warm shower. The Bible fell into the trash with a soft thud. "Excellent," Elias said, standing up and brushing off his coat. I'll give you a ride to the house. We can't have my employee walking the streets." As they drove through the empty streets of Millbrook, Lourdes sat in the passenger seat, clutching the envelope of money. The car's heater warmed her body, but something inside her had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. The house on Magnolia Street looked exactly as she'd left it 2 months ago, but walking through, the door felt like entering a stranger's home. Everything was the same, yet everything was different. She was different. "Get some rest," Elias said from the doorway. "Big day Monday. We're going to be very happy together, Lourdes. You'll see." After he left, Lourdes sat in her old living room, holding the money in her lap. She had everything she'd lost and more. She was warm, fed, secure. She had her dignity back, her independence, her future. So why did she feel like she'd lost everything that mattered? 3 months had passed since. Lourdes returned to her old life, and by all external measures she was thriving. The job at Crawford's Antiques paid better than before. Her house was comfortable and warm, and she had money in the bank for the first time in years. She'd even bought herself new clothes and started eating regularly again. But success, she discovered, could be its own kind of prison. The money Elias had given her bought material comfort, but it came with invisible chains. Every morning when she arrived at work, his eyes followed her with a proprietary satisfaction that made her skin crawl. He'd upgraded her duties to include more personal services, organizing his home office, preparing coffee for his business, meetings, even occasional errands to his house. "You're looking much better," he commented one February morning as she dusted the shop's display cases. "Regular meals and a warm bed do wonders, don't they?" "Yes, sir," Lourdes replied, her voice neutral. She'd learned to keep her responses minimal, professional. Any hint of the person she used to be seemed to amuse him in ways that made her uncomfortable. "I've been thinking," Elias continued, leaning against the counter in his familiar pose. "This arrangement is working out so well, maybe it's time to make it more permanent." Lourdes paused in her dusting. "Sir, I mean making our relationship official. You're a beautiful woman, Lourdes, and you're clearly practical now. We could be very good for each other." The duster slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. Even though she'd seen this coming, even though some part of her had been dreading this moment since the day she accepted his bargain, hearing the words out loud hit her like a physical blow. "I need to think about that, Mr. Crawford." "Of course you do, but don't think too long. Good things don't wait forever." That evening, Lourdes sat in her living room staring at the corner where she used to kneel and pray. The space looked empty now, purposeless. She'd removed all traces of her former faith as thoroughly as she'd removed her Bible from her life. The small wooden cross from the mantel, the inspirational calendar from the kitchen wall, even the gospel CDs she used to play while cleaning. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before, without hymns or prayers or the whispered conversations she used to have with God. The silence felt oppressive, unnatural. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Maya's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mama? I've been worried about you. Your letters have been so different lately." Lourdes had been writing to her daughter regularly, sharing news about her, improved circumstances, but carefully avoiding any mention of faith, church, or spiritual matters. Apparently, the absence was noticeable. "Different how, baby? I don't know, just emptier, I guess. You used to quote scripture, talk about your church friends, mention what Pastor Williams was preaching about. Now you just talk about work. And the weather. Maybe I'm just getting older, more practical. Mama, are you okay? Really okay? Because if you need me to come out there..." "No, don't do that. I'm fine, Maya. Better than I've been in a long time." After she hung up, Lourdes sat in the silence and tried to remember what fine used to feel like. Before, even in the worst times, there had been an underlying sense of purpose, of being part of something larger than herself. Now she had security, but she'd lost her sense of meaning. She walked to her bedroom, and opened the closet where she'd hidden the one thing she couldn't bring herself to completely discard. A small photo of her and Samuel on their wedding day, standing in front of First Baptist Church. They looked so young, so hopeful, so certain that God had brought them together. "What would you think of me now, Sam?" she whispered to the photograph. "Would you understand why I made the choices I made?" But Samuel's face, frozen in that moment of joy 50 years ago, offered no answers. The next morning brought news that made Lords's stomach turn. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had briefly taken her in during her homelessness, had passed away in her sleep. The funeral would be at First Baptist Church. The church Lords hadn't entered in 3 months. "You'll need to take the afternoon off for the funeral," Elias said when she asked for time off. "But just the afternoon. We have inventory to finish." "Yes, sir. And Lords, I trust you remember our arrangement. No backsliding into old habits just because you're in that building again." Standing in the parking lot of First Baptist Church that afternoon, Lords felt like she was approaching a foreign country. The familiar brick building, the hand-painted sign, the cars she recognized belonging to people she'd once considered family. Everything looked the same, but she felt like a stranger. Inside, Pastor Williams was delivering a eulogy that celebrated Mrs. Henderson's faith, her kindness, her unwavering trust in God's goodness even in difficult times. The congregation sang hymns that Lords had once known by heart, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed to touch something deep inside, her that she'd tried to bury. After the service, Pastor Williams approached her in the parking lot. "Sister Lords," he said, his face showing genuine joy at seeing her. "We've missed you so much. How are you?" "I'm fine, Pastor, just fine. We've been praying for you, hoping you'd come back to us. Your seat in the third pew hasn't been the same without you." Lords felt tears threatening for the first time in months. "I've been busy. New job, you know." "Of course. But you know you're always welcome here. This is your home, your family." As she drove back to work, Lords couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just visited a life that used to belong to someone else, someone she used to be, but could never be again. Spring came early to Alabama that year, but Lords barely noticed the blooming dogwoods or the warming sunshine. Her world had shrunk to the narrow confines of her Faustian bargain with Elias Crawford, and each day felt like walking deeper into a maze with no exit. The marriage proposal, when it came officially, arrived with all the romance of a business contract. Elias had waited until a Saturday morning in March, when they were alone in the antique shop, to present her with a diamond ring and a prenuptial agreement. "This makes sense for both of us," he explained, his tone the same one he used to negotiate property deals. "You get security, social standing, financial stability. I get a beautiful, practical wife who understands how the world really works." Lords stared at the ring, a gaudy thing that caught the morning light streaming through the shop windows. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified by the cold calculation of it all. Now, it just felt inevitable. "When?" she asked. "Next month." Small ceremony, just legal witnesses. No need for all that church nonsense. The irony wasn't lost on her. Once, she dreamed of renewing her wedding vows with Samuel in the church where they'd first married. Now, she was planning a wedding specifically designed to avoid any hint of sacred commitment. "I'll need to call Maya, let her know." "Actually, I've been thinking about that." Elias's voice carried a note of careful consideration. "Your daughter and her family, they're still very religious, aren't they? Might be awkward having them here for the wedding. Might make you uncomfortable." Lords understood what he wasn't saying directly. Maya would ask questions, would wonder why her mother was marrying a man she'd never mentioned, would want to know why the ceremony wasn't in a church. Maya would see through the facade Lords had built and recognize the hollowness underneath. "You're probably right," Lords said quietly. "I'll just send her a letter afterward." That evening, Lord sat at her kitchen table with a pen and paper, trying to write a letter she'd never dreamed she'd have to write. How do you tell your daughter that you've abandoned everything she thought you believed? How do you explain that faith, which had sustained you through poverty and loss and loneliness, had finally been revealed as worthless in the face of practical necessity? The letter went through 7 drafts before she finally sealed it and put it in the mail. Even then, she knew it was inadequate, a collection of half-truths and omissions that would raise more questions than it answered. The wedding took place on a Thursday afternoon in the county courthouse, witnessed by Elias's lawyer and his secretary. Lords wore a new dress, purchased specifically for the occasion. Navy blue, conservative, expensive. She looked like the wife of a successful businessman, which was exactly what she'd become. Judge Morrison, who'd known Elias for years, performed. The brief ceremony with efficient professionalism. The words about love and honor and cherishing felt hollow, legal formalities that had to be spoken but carried no real meaning. When Elias kissed her at the end, his lips were cold and tasted of ambition fulfilled. "Mrs. Crawford," he said with satisfaction as they left the courthouse. "That has a nice ring to it, but it didn't feel like her name. It felt like a costume she was wearing, a role she was playing in someone else's story." That night, in the master bedroom of Elias's large house on Elm Street, Lourdes lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Through the window, she could see the steeple of First Baptist Church in the distance, illuminated by streetlights. Once that view would have comforted her, a reminder that God was watching over the town while it slept. Now it felt like an accusation. The phone call from Maya came 3 days later, and it was everything Lourdes had dreaded. "Mama, what is this? What are you talking about, getting married to some man I've never heard of? And why didn't you have a church wedding? What happened to you?" "Maya, honey, I know it's sudden, but..." "Sudden? Mama, you haven't mentioned this man in any of your letters. You haven't talked about dating anyone. And now you're married to someone who apparently doesn't believe in God?" The conversation lasted an hour and ended with Maya crying and Lourdes feeling like she'd lost her daughter along with everything else. "I don't understand what's happened to you, Mama," Maya said through her tears. "You sound like a completely different person. Where's the woman who taught me to pray? Where's the woman who read me Bible stories and sang gospel songs while she cooked dinner? People change, baby. Life changes them. Not like this. Not this much. Something's wrong, and I'm going to figure out what it is." After Maya hung up, Lourdes sat in the expensive silence of her new home and realized that the price of her bargain with Elias Crawford wasn't just her faith. It was everything that had made her who she was. She'd wanted money, security, comfort. She'd gotten all of those things. But in the process, she'd lost her daughter's respect, her community's fellowship, her sense of purpose, and her own soul. As spring turned to summer in Millbrook, Lourdes Crawford lived in a beautiful house, wore expensive clothes, and had money in the bank. She was, by every material measure, successful. But every morning when she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger wearing her face. Every night when she tried to sleep, the silence was deafening. And every time she passed First Baptist Church, she remembered the woman she used to be, poor but rich in spirit, struggling but sustained by hope, alone but never truly lonely because she'd never doubted that God was with her. Now she had everything she'd thought she wanted, and she'd never felt more impoverished in her life. The old lady had indeed paid a high price, not just for money, but for the comfort that money could buy. And as the summer heat settled over Alabama like a heavy blanket, Lourdes Crawford began to understand that some prices are too high to pay, even when you've already paid them. The question that haunted her now was whether it was too late to find her way back to the woman she used to be, or whether some bargains, once made, could never be undone. In the end, she realized, she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for. She'd just never understood what she'd have to give up to get it. The end.